For centuries, the Nile was the lifeblood of an empire. It was a source of creation, a highway for trade, a divine gift to a golden civilization. But for one forgotten age, it became a river of bones. We're going back to a time of brutal warfare, when the pharaohs of Egypt clashed with the warrior kings of Nubia. It was a conflict so savage, it was said the Nile itself ran red with the blood of armies. This is the story of a brutal conquest hidden by golden masks and the Black Pharaohs who rose from the ashes to conquer their conquerors. Head south from the golden heart of Egypt, where fertile plains give way to rugged hills and the Nile's calm waters are broken by raging cataracts. You'd enter another ancient land, one the Egyptians called Ta Seti, the land of the bow. We know it as Nubia. For much of history, Nubia's story has been told as a footnote to Egypt's, a lesser kingdom, a source of gold and soldiers, forever in its northern neighbor's shadow. But that's a carefully constructed piece of propaganda carved into temple walls by pharaohs desperate to project their own power. The truth is much more complicated. Nubia was a powerhouse in its own right, the home of the mighty kingdom of Kush. It was the gateway for the riches of Africa, ivory, ebony, incense, to flow into the Mediterranean world, and its warriors were legendary. Nubian archers were so feared for their accuracy, they were nicknamed the eye shooters. Their skill was so prized that even the pharaohs, who belittled them in public, eagerly recruited them as mercenaries. In fact, tribes like the Medjay became elite police forces, a vital part of the very Egyptian state they would one day rule. This was the strange, tense relationship between the two kingdoms. Egypt, the sprawling, bureaucratic empire, depended on Nubia for its gold and its best soldiers, and Nubia, the resilient, martial kingdom, looked north with a mix of resentment and ambition. During Egypt's Old and Middle Kingdoms, pharaohs pushed south, building colossal fortresses to control the river and the flow of trade. They took Nubia's wealth and its people, viewing it as a resource to be plundered. But that kind of relationship, it's a powder keg just waiting for a spark. The balance of power on the Nile was never going to last, so what happens when an empire that thinks it's invincible starts to crumble? History loves a good reversal of fortune, and no empire, not even one that believes it's eternal, is safe. Around 1700 BCE, Egypt fell into chaos. The authority of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs collapsed. Foreign rulers, the Hyksos, seized the Nile Delta, and a power vacuum opened up in the south. For the Nubians, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. From their capital at Kerma, the kings of Kush saw their chance and took it. They weren't just a collection of tribes anymore, they were a unified, ambitious kingdom ready for war. They surged north, not as raiders, but as a conquering army. The great Egyptian fortresses that had oppressed them for centuries were overrun. Kushite warriors sacked the symbols of Egyptian power, pushing into southern Egypt and hauling away treasures and prisoners. For the first time, the so-called Vile Kush had brought the fight right to the pharaoh's doorstep. It was a stunning turn of events. The exploited had become the aggressors. The conquered were now the conquerors. This period proved the rivalry between Egypt and Nubia wasn't one-sided. It was a true contest between two great powers. The Nubians showed they could not only resist, but project their own power, creating a kingdom that rivaled Egypt itself. But this humiliation lit a fire under the Egyptians. As they rallied to drive the Hyksos from their lands, a new dynasty of warrior pharaohs rose in Thebes. Their eyes turned south, not just to reclaim what was lost, but for revenge. The new kingdom was coming, and with it, a new and terrible chapter of violence. The new kingdom that rose from the ashes around 1550 BCE was Egypt at the absolute peak of its power. Led by ruthless pharaohs like Thutmose I and the great conqueror Thutmose III, Egypt was no longer content to just control its borders. It wanted an empire, and its first target was the Nubian kingdom that had dared to challenge it. What followed wasn't just a war, it was a campaign of total subjugation. The Egyptian war machine, fresh from its victory over the Hyksos, was unleashed on Nubia with terrifying force. Thutmose I boasted of hanging the body of a Nubian chief from the front of his ship as he sailed home to Thebes, a gruesome warning to anyone else who dared resist. His successors pushed deeper and deeper into Kush, burning cities, enslaving entire populations, and crushing all opposition. This is where the Nile metaphorically became a river of bones. The violence was so extreme, some scholars have called it a forgotten attempt to erase the Kushite identity. On temple walls, pharaohs ordered their artists to create a powerful narrative of supremacy. They carved images of Nubians as grotesque caricatures, bound and trampled beneath the pharaoh's feet. It was state propaganda designed to justify the brutal conquest and cement the idea of Egyptian superiority. The ultimate goal was the complete Egyptianization of Nubia. The kingdom of Kerma was destroyed. Egyptian colonial towns were built, and magnificent temples like Abu Simbel were carved into the cliffs of Nubia itself, intimidating permanent symbols of pharaonic might. Nubian children, especially the sons of local chiefs, were taken to the Egyptian court to be re-educated, their culture systematically stripped away and replaced with loyalty to their conquerors. For much of the New Kingdom period, Nubia was treated as an occupied province. Its gold filled the tombs of pharaohs like Tutankhamun. Its warriors were forced to fight Egypt's wars. Its people were made to worship Egyptian gods. It seemed the proud spirit of Kush was broken forever. But as a power vacuum once again emerged on the Nile, something new was stirring in the south, forged in the memory of past glory and burning for retribution. Fast forward to the 8th century BCE, and the mighty New Kingdom is a shadow of its former self. The empire had fractured into a patchwork of squabbling city-states. Egypt was politically divided, spiritually adrift, and ripe for the taking. Down in Nubia, the flame had been kept alive. A new Kushite kingdom had risen, centered around the city of Napata. The Napatan kings saw themselves not as a separate culture, but as the true preservers of traditional Egyptian values they believed the princes of the north had betrayed. They worshipped the Egyptian god Amun, wrote in hieroglyphs, and built pyramids in their own distinct style. They saw themselves not as foreigners, but as the rightful heirs to the pharaoh's throne. This conviction found its champion in a king named Pi-I. Around 730 BCE, a northern ruler began uniting Lower Egypt, threatening the Kushite sphere of influence. For Pi-I, this wasn't just politics, it was sacrilege. Declaring it a holy war commanded by the god Amun himself, he set out to restore order and piety to the Nile. His great victory stele gives us an unparalleled look into his mind. He ordered his soldiers to ritually purify themselves before battle. He's not portrayed as a greedy conqueror, but as a righteous crusader. Pi-I's army swept north with strategic brilliance, using both land and river forces. City after city fell. When Hermopolis was captured after a 5-month siege, Pi-I didn't celebrate. Instead, he was furious to find the royal stables neglected and the horses starving. Recording this detail was a stroke of political genius, painting him as a compassionate ruler who cared more for animals than for humiliating his enemies. The final obstacle was the ancient capital of Memphis. Heavily fortified and fiercely defended, it looked like it would require a long siege. Instead, Pi-I launched a daring assault, using the masts of captured boats to scale the walls. Memphis fell quickly. The remaining northern kings bowed to him. The ultimate irony was complete. The conquered had become the saviors. The Nubian king was now the undisputed master of Egypt. Piye returned to Nubia, never to set foot in Egypt again, but he had laid the foundation for the 25th dynasty. His successors, like his brother Shabako, would rule from Egypt as the Black Pharaohs, uniting the entire Nile Valley. They were seen by many not as occupiers, but as restorers of order, sparking a renaissance in Egyptian culture. But empires are fleeting, and a new, ruthless power was rising in the east, Assyria. It was a new golden age, but it wasn't built to last. The 25th dynasty's involvement in Near Eastern politics put them on a collision course with the unstoppable Assyrian war machine. The Assyrians invaded Egypt, and after a series of brutal campaigns, the great Kushite pharaoh Taharka was driven out of Memphis. The Nubian rulers were forced to retreat south, back to their homeland. The dream of a unified Nile kingdom was over. But the rivalry wasn't. A resurgent Egyptian dynasty led a punitive campaign deep into Nubia around 593 BCE, a violent echo of past conquests, leaving behind graffiti from Greek mercenaries as a taunt. Still, the Kushite kingdom endured. It simply moved its heartland further south to the city of Meroe. Safe from Egyptian interference, the kingdom of Kush would thrive here for hundreds of years, developing its own unique culture and a script we still can't decipher. And it would produce one of history's most formidable female rulers. By 30 BCE, Egypt had fallen to a new superpower, Rome. The Romans figured Nubia was the next logical prize. They were wrong. The ruling queen of Meroe, the Kandake, was a one-eyed warrior named Amanirenas. When the Romans tried to impose taxes, she didn't wait to be attacked. Around 25 BCE, Amanirenas led an army of 30,000 soldiers into Roman-controlled Egypt. They stormed 3 major cities, enslaved the inhabitants, and toppled statues of Emperor Augustus. In an incredible act of defiance, they hacked off a bronze head of the emperor and buried it under the steps of a temple in Meroe, so everyone entering would symbolically trample on the face of the most powerful man in the world. The Roman response was swift and brutal. The prefect of Egypt marched south, sacked the old capital of Napata, and drove the Kushites back. But Amanirenas was not defeated. She counterattacked, fighting the Romans for 3 years. In the end, the conflict was settled with a peace treaty that was surprisingly favorable to Kush. Augustus Caesar agreed to withdraw all Roman forces, cancel the taxes, and establish a formal border. The small kingdom of Kush had faced down the Roman Empire and won. Amanirenas had secured her kingdom's independence. It was a final, stunning display of Nubian resilience. But over the next few centuries, the kingdom slowly declined. Around 350 AD, Meroe was conquered by the neighboring kingdom of Aksum, and the long, proud story of ancient Kush faded into the desert sands. The story of the Nile isn't one story, but 2. It's a tale of 2 civilizations bound together by a river and locked in a 3,000-year struggle for power, wealth, and identity. It was a relationship of endless cycles, conquest and revenge, domination and liberation. The river that gave both kingdoms life was also a silent witness to their endless war. For centuries, this history was buried, literally, under the sands of Sudan, and figuratively by Egyptian propaganda and the biases of early archaeologists. Many couldn't imagine that a black African culture could truly rival the might of Egypt. They saw Nubia only through the eyes of its conquerors, a primitive land, good only for gold and slaves. But today, that's all changing. Archaeologists are excavating the great cities of Kerma, Napata, and Meroe. We are translating the words of King Piye from his victory monument, hearing his voice declare himself the righteous conqueror of a fallen land. We are piecing together the story of Queen Amanirenas, the one-eyed Kandake who stared down the Roman emperor and made him blink. We're rediscovering a forgotten legacy, This wasn't a vassal state, it was a proud and powerful civilization that stood as Egypt's equal, its rival, and for one glorious century, its master. Theirs is a story of resilience against all odds, a testament to a people who were conquered, rose from the ashes to rule their conquerors, and stared down the greatest empires of the ancient world. It's a stark reminder that history is often written by the powerful, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that were deliberately silenced. If you believe forgotten histories like this one deserve to be told, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Like this video to help us bring more stories to light, and tell us in the comments which forgotten conflict you think we should explore next. Thanks for watching.